This is one of the more remote islands in the South Pacific. Many centuries ago, humans migrated here and established a way of life that has changed very little. Today it's a popular destination for tourists who come to enjoy the beauty and tranquility away from the noise and bustle of modern existence. In some islands, people have shown little inclination to move with the times or change just for the sake of changing. Theirs is a way of life learned from their ancestors. It has served the people well, as one generation succeeds another. But in one respect, their customs are unique. The ancient practice of land diving. Not quite a sport, not quite a ritual. The older men did it in their time, and now it's the turn of today's young men to demonstrate their skill and courage. Each year, land diving takes place at the time of the yam harvest, as vital to the people of Vanuatu as rice and potatoes are to others in other parts of the world. Here on the island of Pentecost, the birthplace for land diving, the traditions have been maintained for the last 2,000 years. Nature has been kind and society has carefully preserved it. It seems that the secure life has created the challenge of the land diving culture, to be prepared for an undefined future. As each young man takes his place at the top of the rickety man-made tower, a rope of vine leaves is attached to each ankle. For someone watching for the first time, it's hard to believe that accurate measurements have been taken to protect the safety of the divers. One by one, the young men launched themselves from the tower in the approved manner, trusting their lives to someone else's calculations. There are accidents, but not many. Taking risks is part of the human condition, and always has been. But now, at the beginning of the 21st century, not just the South Sea Islanders, but mankind as a whole must face the biggest risk of all, nothing less than the destruction of our world. Humans have been treating the Earth for centuries without much concern about their impact on it. But this must change. The diversity of life on our planet is challenged by the growing number of people and by our multifarious activities. Will humans ever address this threat with one voice? Before speaking, it's sensible to listen to wisdom from people committed to saving the planet. This film invites them to share their wisdom and invites you to listen to it and to act. One of these people is Professor Ranil Sananaika from Sri Lanka.
Today we are willing to spend almost $1 trillion, according to the people who are looking at the carbon market, to stop climate change, to slow down climate change. If my only assumption here is that we as human beings are willing to pay the same amount to breathe and live as we would pay to control climate change, $1 trillion. If you look at that, then you would find that this photosynthetic biomass is worth about $260 per kilogram. Not $15 a ton, $250 a kilogram for looking after the photosynthetic biomass and developing the photosynthetic biomass of the planet. Here is the new engine for growth. Here is the new engine for development. And the only effective performers who can do that are the people who live in the rural sector. And so therefore here is the money that we can take to the rural sector and say, build back, help us build back the life support systems of this planet so that our children can afford to live into the future.
Margot Wallström must be one of the best known and most admired women in Sweden. While a member of the European Commission, she formed the view that climate change is a threat, not just to the environment, but to economic and social development.
I'm also fully aware of the risks, and I think that if we start to deny science or contradict science, for example in such an important area as climate change, if we sort of actively contradict what we know would be also better for humankind, then we are in a very dangerous state. So I don't underestimate also both the dangers and the challenges that we see ahead of us. But invest in women is my simple answer.
One man who has had many years of experience working at the United Nations and other international agencies is the Swedish diplomat Carl Waren. He is in no doubt about what lies at the root of the problem: overpopulation.
I remember the Queen of Tonga, one of my favorites, who stirred the United Nations in the General Assembly when for the first time a head of state stood up among all these diplomats and other heads of states and said, "Mr. Chairman, production and reproduction must go hand in hand." And she described how on a small island they could already envision what would happen to the planet, which is just sort of one level above the small islands. And she said we need to have a balance between people and food, etc. And subsequently they produced even a coin, which I always bring in my wallet, which says planned families, food for all. If you live in a small area, then you have to adjust to the resources that exist locally. And what is this planet if not a very, very small planet in a very small solar system in a rather recent galaxy in the universe?
If the human population on this planet continues to increase at the same rate, by the year 2030 we will need 50% more food, 30% more fresh water, and nearly twice as much energy. Almost all serious scientific opinion has reached this conclusion. These goals are completely unattainable. The Maldives, an island archipelago in the Indian Ocean with 1,100 islands, have long been considered a tourist paradise, a place to relax with the troubles of the world far away over the horizon. There is only one problem with this vision of enchantment. At no point throughout the entire archipelago are the islands themselves more than 2 meters above sea level. If climate change and global warming cause the level of the ocean to rise, even by that relatively small amount, then the Maldive Islands will disappear, and with them large parts of Bangladesh and East Africa. Many millions of people will find themselves without a homeland. When Thor Heyerdahl first visited the islands in the 1980s, he decided that this would be the place for his next major expedition. The stone heads of various Hindu and Buddhist deities convinced him that the islands had been populated at least 4,000 years earlier than the official history books suggested. What he could not know was that in the 30 years that lay ahead, Male, the nation's capital, would see more drastic and fundamental changes than at any time in its history. At the time of Heyerdahl's visit, the city's population was about 20,000. Today, it is well over 100,000, with birth control a taboo subject for most of the population. In the next 20 years, that number may double again. People who live on small but beautiful islands everywhere face the same dilemma as the people of the Maldives. Their standard of living depends on the tourist trade, but visitors come in search of peace and tranquility. To ease the growing congestion, they might build new towns on some of the other islands, but this would undermine their most precious asset, the azure sea and soft white sand. One of the world's most respected authorities on population trends and their consequences is the American scholar Lester Brown.
The UN demographers are projecting that world population during this half century will increase by 3 billion. I don't think so. I don't think so because systems are already breaking down. Aquifers are being depleted, forests are disappearing, soils are eroding. And so I don't think we're going to add 3 billion more people. What I don't know is why we will not add them. Will it be because we accelerate the shift to smaller families and level off the population growth curve, or because we fail to do that and mortality rates begin to rise?
The capital of the Maldive Islands, Male, has had a taste of what might lie ahead repeatedly during its history. It happened, for example, some decades ago, when an intense atmospheric storm caused waves to sweep across the Indian Ocean with relentless, unstoppable force. Walls of water up to 4 meters high struck the islands that lay directly in their path. Young boys came out onto the streets and jetties of the capital. They thought it was a great game, but it was not. As a portent of what the future might hold, it was a grim warning. The capital of the Maldives, Male, bestrides an island that is only a few kilometers long and 1 kilometer wide. There is only one direction for new building to take, and that is towards the sky. Before long, the people will be living in narrow canyons of concrete and steel, without a glimpse of the vast ocean all around them. The man with the thankless task of being Minister for the Environment in the Maldives is Mohammed Aslam.
We find some of our islands, very difficult to live on now. We have to adapt with the changes. We also have to accept the fact what has been done in the past is going to continue to affect us for some times into the future. So life will become very harsh, difficult. We will have to adjust with that. We have to adapt ourselves with that. So there are 2 things to do. One, to adapt with the changes that is going to be inevitable. 2, to mitigate the effects of climate change. We continue to fight on both of these tracks.
The tourist market worldwide is fickle and volatile. If for whatever reason the visitors stayed away, the effect on the Maldives' economy would be catastrophic. What can be done?
The thing is, people are now realizing that we need to plant more trees. Afforestation is something that is spoken about. The acronym REDD+ in climate negotiations is all about that.
In the last 20 years or so, it is South Korea that has led the way. For the building of roads and bridges, and above all, for the planting of trees, the government promised to supply the materials if the local villagers would carry out the work. It has been a massive success, with over 30,000 villages taking part. Nowhere else in the world has a tree planting program been carried out with such speed and on such a scale. In 2010, South Korea earned the reward of being chosen to host the IUFRO Congress of the International Union of Forest Research Organization. For once on our overcrowded planet, here was something to celebrate. For the delegates, the message was clear. If South Korea could do it, then so could other parts of the world. And the host nation made sure that young people were there to pass on the good news.
A lot of countries try to deforest, but with varying degrees of success. South Korea, after the Korean War in the 1950s, the forests were decimated. There are almost no trees left. And President Park organized a tree planting effort. And it was organized at the village level, and villages were required to plant trees on the hills and the mountains near where they lived. And they did a good job, and they managed the forests well. The survival rates of the trees were high. And today, 65% of South Korea is covered with forests.
Without doubt, this was something to commemorate. But is 65% forest cover of the available land too much? The delegates were free to decide such questions for themselves. Trees may help to save our environment, but they don't put food into empty stomachs. It's all a question of striking the right balance, of creating harmony between man and the natural world. The people of Asia have been striving to achieve that harmony for many centuries. For them, it has a spiritual as well as a scientific dimension. Don Koo Lee is a former president of the Forest Research Organization.
I guess 2050, probably we are planting trees in overseas and tropical area, Indonesia, in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, because they are growing 10 times faster than those in Korea. So also we are, they have resources, but we have technologies, and then we can exchange. Also, we are bring those young people to here, educating them and back to there, and then we can trade. They can export natural resources, whatever, even timbers, what we planted once.
The UFRO conference is over. The delegates will be returning to 100 different countries, all with forest problems of their own. They have much to think about. How much of the Korean experience will they take home with them? Some will be returning to the great deciduous forests, sometimes called arboreal forests of the northern hemisphere. Trees that shed their leaves with the approach of winter are widely considered to be more vulnerable to sudden changes of temperature, which can affect the humidity of the soil as well as the air. But from another point of view, these countries of the north, like Canada in the New World or Scandinavia in the Old, have an abundance of that most precious commodity, water. As a buffer against climate change, it has been estimated that the water resources of Canada, which has easily the largest water resources of any country in the world, contribute more than $700 billion to the prosperity of North America. The symbol for all this water power is Niagara, perhaps the most famous waterfall in the world, straddling the border between Canada and the United States. Situated on a stretch of river where Lake Erie drains into Lake Ontario, at 50 meters the falls are not especially high, but taken together the three falls are very wide. At full flood, more than 60 million cubic feet of water fall over the crest line every minute. With a similar abundance of water resources, the Scandinavian countries have been using hydroelectric power for over a century. But even in Scandinavia, with its small populations and high standard of living, the equivalent of $1 billion had to be spent to upgrade this power station and stabilize the walls of the dam. It became a matter of urgency to meet the threat of unpredictable floods caused by climate change. For many years, throughout the Nordic countries, it has been normal for heavy industrial installations to be built along the banks of the many rivers. The beauty of the environment was often a secondary consideration, compared with an endless supply of inexpensive power obtained quite simply by harnessing the fast-flowing current. But after the first United Nations conference on the global environment was held in Stockholm in 1972, there was a dramatic change of emphasis that no country, and certainly none in Scandinavia, could afford to ignore. The effect was felt, first and foremost, by the old and dirty pulp and paper industry, where modernization had long been overdue. The demand now was for paper products that were chlorine-free and that could be produced without polluting the rivers or nearby agricultural land. It was also considered essential that raw materials be obtained from renewable forests. Today we humans are using enormous quantities of packing products we could hardly think of half a century ago. Every year we use around 1 trillion plastic bags, and every day millions of paper cups and cartons for liquid products are used. The pressure on forests must be severe. What about this huge processing plant with its need for 700,000 tons of pulp a year? Its manager is Ingrid Engström.
We are in a region where the availability of wood is rather good. Our wood comes from this local region, but also from Norway. And if we are looking at European forest, it's growing year by year, and the volume has never been as high as it is today.
Scientist Marie Larsson-Stern is one of many women working in Swedish forestry.
We believe that in the future there will be high and increasing demand of forest products, both in Sweden and in the rest of the world. And therefore we need to increase the growth in the forests. For instance, hybrid larch has been a very interesting tree species for private forest owners in southern Sweden after the Hurricane Gudrun in year 2005. The forests we plant today will be grown up and ready to harvest in 60 to 120 years. So it's not possible to make quick changes, of course. And also with the climate change, you don't know when it will come, so you can't change into something completely different today. I believe that we have to adapt our silvicultural systems in a way that makes us more flexible in the future.
The presence of so much heavy machinery in Sweden's once tranquil forests causes many city dwellers to jump to the conclusion that the industry is simply ripping up Sweden's precious heritage, leaving nothing behind but dirt and devastation. The outcry against the use of trenching machines like this one is sometimes deafening. The logging companies are accused of brushing aside all aesthetic and environmental considerations simply to meet a world demand for more and more unnecessary packaging. In fact, the purpose of this rather sinister-looking device is to prepare the ground for replanting as quickly as possible, after the tree fellers have done their work. Olaf Johansson is the Senior Vice President at Sveaskog, the Swedish state forestry company. Does he have any sympathy for those who think that the industry is trying to do too much, too fast?
Maybe so, but I think that might be unavoidable because forests and the forest resource is becoming maybe more and more important in many aspects. We have to rely on the forests for many uses, for timber, but also for non-timber products. And we know that forests are essential for combating climate change, as well as keeping up biodiversity. And these are issues that are very high on the agenda today for different stakeholder groups and for the world as a whole. So I think it's only natural that we have a live debate on how to best use our forests and how to weigh the different interests between each other.
Wood, cardboard and paper products constitute Sweden's largest export industry. From just 1% of the world's renewable timber, this relatively small country has achieved a world market share of about 10%. Using old methods and technology, this could not continue without steadily diminishing the forest area. But in fact, the opposite is taking place. The forest's biomass is still increasing by 3% every year. Due to new harvesting planning, the sustainable forestry will continue as long as global warming and the level of climate change continue at today's levels. 100 years ago, countries like Britain, France and Germany were as heavily forested as the Nordic countries are today, which makes it all the more difficult to lecture developing countries, like Brazil and Indonesia, about preserving their heavily wooded areas, when we ourselves in Western Europe did no such thing. But times have changed, and the danger is now there for all to see. The planet is facing a new threat, climate change, and mitigating emission from fossil fuel has become an imperative wherever we live. In the last 30 years, the reported incidence of serious floods and storms has tripled worldwide. Orderly seasons and predictable weather patterns have almost become a distant memory. Tourists who fly to the other side of the globe to escape the severity of their own winter can be left wondering why they ever set out. this Japanese couple were expecting a rather different experience in the land of the midnight sun.
And we don't expect something like this. You know, it should be fjord and blue sky, and like a blue sea with blue sky, something like that, and sunset every night. But here you can see, where's the sun? Where's Mr. Sunshine?
Ironically, the aurora borealis, or northern lights, a phenomenon caused by the collision of atoms with charged particles in the polar atmosphere, have nothing to do with climate change. But the albedo, or reflection from snow-covered northern territory, mitigates global warming as long as the snow is clean and white. In winter, the absence of trees seems endless and gives us a somber impression of how barren this planet might become if all the life-giving vegetation were consumed by our ever-growing, ever more heedless human population. But when summer arrives and the midnight sun produces its wonder of light and energy 24 hours a day, the landscape appears to be from another world. The trace of humans' need for energy is everywhere, and the need for survival in the north is completely different from life in the south. This has made an impact on the whole of society for many centuries, and inventiveness has been a distinguishing mark for these northern people. Yet every year, new uses are found for the trees that support us. This is the world's first tall oil plant. The motive for its construction in 2010 was clear enough. It was to take some of the pressure off the world's dwindling supply of fossil fuels and convert earlier useless black loot in the paper industry to something different. The inventor of the technique and founder of the production company Sunpine is Lars Stigson.
The tall oil is produced from mostly pine, but also some from spruce and some from birch. The fatty acids is coming from birch as well. So I think the best tall oil we have in the northern hemisphere, in Canada, Sweden, Finland, Russia, where we produce high quality, high acid value tall oil that is very suitable for this process. That can be used in any car, diesel type of engine. You don't need to do any modifications in the engines. This is blended in various proportions into fossil fuel and can be also used as a neat fuel where you don't have to mix any fossil material in.
No one should doubt man's ingenuity in producing oil from wood, but with so much pressure on the world's forests already, the question must be asked, might these celebrations be a little premature? Wherever we choose to find it, all the energy this planet needs derives ultimately from the sun. In some respects, the logging countries of the northern hemisphere are quite fortunate. Corruption is not a serious problem, and there is no illegal logging on a large scale. But world forestry needs common agreements for its trade. The establishment of FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, is an attempt to work towards a solution. The chairman for forest trade, Olof Johansson, has been involved from the very beginning.
The FSC has reached a level of success that was not foreseen just 10 years ago. So now we have, in the world, there are around 140 million of hectares. But I think that it's very important, and it's sort of at the heart of FSC, to try to improve the situation in the southern hemisphere, and not least in the tropical regions, because most of the biodiversity in the world depends on forest ecosystems in the tropical regions, and we are seeing that FSC is also progressing in areas like in certain parts of Latin America today.
This is Atlantic Forest in Bahia, the northeastern region of Brazil, that in the past, together with Amazonas, formed the world's largest rainforest. For reasons that can be traced back to the Ice Age, a geological corridor was formed, perhaps as long as 21,000 years ago. Down the centuries, it became a refuge for the largest variety of fauna and flora to be found anywhere on our planet. That explains what these men are doing, engaged in a unique and vital treasure hunt. Their job is to collect seeds, bulbs and cuttings from as many species as possible. the Atlantic forest harbours almost 20,000 species and has been designated a World Biosphere Reserve. The area is so rich in biodiversity that as many as 450 tree species can be found in a single hectare. It is of vital importance to save the collected seeds for future use in forest restoration. There may even be species still unknown to man that could be the source of new foods and medicines. The very survival of mankind depends on maintaining the Brazilian rainforest. Vast areas that have been decimated by forest fires or human exploitation may have to be restored. But as Francis Seymour well knows, humans still manage to get in the way of progress.
We have C4 scientists based in Brazil who've published research on the fact that of the large area of Amazonian rainforest still intact that would be economically viable for red, only about half of them would be feasible because the other half are too conflicted in terms of their land tenure status. So clearly that's something that's going to have to be sorted out.
In 1992, there was an international conference in Rio de Janeiro on the future of the world's forests. In the years since then, and as the 21st century gets into its stride, Brazil has come to be seen as the country providing us with most of the questions and some of the answers. But there's more to a forest than the trees that grow there, as Professor Sananaika explains.
If you look at a forest in terms of its biodiversity, trees account for 1% of the biodiversity of a forest or less. 99% of the biodiversity of a forest is in things other than trees. The bushes, the shrubs, the vines, the epiphytes, the butterflies, the fauna, the flora, the microorganisms. If you look at the biodiversity of a forest, 99% is in that. Only 1% of the biodiversity is in trees. However, if you look at it in terms of biomass, 80% is in the trees.
In some parts of the world, all that is left of the original habitat are fragments of the natural environment, divided from each other by the results of human activity, crops grown for food and fuel, or large-scale urbanization. When this occurs, all the advantages of biodiversity are thrown away. Some species may die out altogether, no longer able to sustain themselves. It's a process that has been going on for thousands of years, ever since humans ceased being hunter-gatherers and learned the more sophisticated techniques of agriculture. It's only now, under the looming threat of overpopulation, that the alarm bells have started to ring. Australia was the original home for almost all of the many species of the eucalyptus tree. However, their speed of growth and ease of management soon made them popular around the world. In Brazil, huge plantations of eucalyptus began to be developed over a century ago, originally as a source of timber and charcoal, but today more and more for the production of pulp and paper. 5 million hectares have so far been planted to feed the ever-growing demand. This company alone now employs 4,000 people. The man in charge of the whole operation is Ari da Silva Madeiros.
It's quite common. The pulp and paper mills 20 years ago have such a smell due to the sulfur compounds of the process. Today, with this development of the technology, those flue gases come from the process are incinerated in the same place like a recovery boiler, and 100% of the smelt is removed with this process. It's a modern process, so we can keep low odor mills with clean concept and giving very good results compared to the past. So we improve the productivity, we improve the environmental cares and technology, so we have no smelt anymore. We have improved the productivity of forest issues. So there were, not only from Veracel, but all over the world, quite good improvements in technology compared to 20 years ago.
Everything that takes place in the factory and out in the plantations is closely monitored in a control room that would be the envy of any modern airport. One section of foresters in Brazil and elsewhere in the world will give you the same message. Thanks to the eucalyptus plantations, much of the remaining natural rainforest will be saved. But there's no escaping the fact that hundreds of species have been replaced by just one. As Professor Sanna Naike points out, a plantation can never become a forest.
We have coconut plantations, we have rubber plantations, we have timber plantations. It's a plantation. It's not a forest. Do not call it a forest. It's not a forest. All right? Now, a forest is what contains all these other aspects to it and all the other functions. So when he says with the timber plantations you can save a forest, the concept probably was, well, if we cut this timber here, we don't have to go and cut the forest there. All right? But it is not, it can help to save the forest. Yes, I agree, but it's not a forest.
Years before Brazil opted for eucalyptus, New Zealand was already experimenting with a species of tree known as radiata pine. It originated in California and was first planted on New Zealand's South Island in 1859. Since then, it has undergone various genetic improvements. Following New Zealand's lead, the radiata pine is now one of the world's most popular plantation trees. During a forest visit to New Zealand in 1993, we met Dr. Wing Sutton, also known as Mr. Radiata.
We've done a great deal of research on the effect of trees and the soil. We are confident that on these sites, which are relatively fertile, volcanic soils, we can go on harvesting trees every 30 years for at least the next 2 to 3 centuries.
There has been plenty of resistance in New Zealand to such a large proportion of the available land being devoted to a single species of tree. But Dr. Sutton knows his own mind.
Plantations satisfy over 97% of our wood supply. In other words, they've changed from 1910, when we had virtually all our wood came from the indigenous forest. Today, almost all our wood comes from plantations. At the same time, we have an industry now which is much bigger than it was in 1910. We satisfy not only our entire demand for wood, but more than half of the wood that we harvest is exported in some form. So we have saved our indigenous forest, and we've provided New Zealand not only with its own wood supplies, but with an exciting and expanding export industry.
In the Nordic countries too, much of the forest area is no longer indigenous but man-made, and has been for over a century. The question now is whether forests here and in other temperate zones will follow the example of Brazil and New Zealand and dramatically increase their timber production. Herman Sundqvist is the Senior Vice President of the Swedish state forestry company Sveaskog.
It's the same situation in Chile, where they only use wood from plantations and they do not use the native forest anymore. And I think that in Sweden as well we can increase yield from man-managed forests to a greater extent and sort of divert the forestry a bit.
When the great naturalist Charles Darwin first saw the Brazilian rainforest, he described it as one great wild untidy hothouse made by nature for herself. The great basin of the Amazon and Orinoco rivers teem with flora and fauna of every description. In Darwin's time, the whole enormous region was virtually undisturbed. It was home to the greatest variety of tropical species, plants and creatures alike, to be found anywhere on our planet. Its size alone, stretching from the Atlantic across most of the South American continent, must have created the impression that it was virtually indestructible. Now, we know better. The insatiable urge on the part of humans to bring more and more of the Earth's surface directly under their control may yet lead to a catastrophe of global proportions. The ongoing destruction of the Indonesian and Brazilian rainforests is frightening.
if the Amazon rainforest were to be destroyed, the CO2 emissions from that would be equal to the CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels for 15 years, the current world level of carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels. So we need to save the Amazon rainforest. If we lose that, we may be toast.
Rio de Janeiro, Brazil's largest city, is famous for its football and other sports and for the annual carnival. The festival atmosphere and laid-back lifestyle seem to last the whole year round, and it's easy to imagine that this must be a city without a care in the world. But underneath the frivolity, more serious matters are being addressed. 2 international conferences devoted to the environment and the threat of climate change have already been held in Rio in 1992 and 2012, and there is likely to be a third, with the delegates speaking with an even greater sense of urgency. Robert Correll is the director of the Global Change Programme.
What are the top 4 emitters of CO2 into the atmosphere on the planet? Number 1 and 2 are China and the United States. The number 3 and 4 are Brazil and Indonesia. And you say, what? It's because of the burning of the forest in Amazonia and doing the same thing in Indonesia, creating huge amounts of CO2 of almost the same, not as high as ours, but it's number 3 and number 4. So it's not only getting rid of gasoline and oil and all the rest, we have to manage our lands a little better so that we don't deforest so much, so rapidly.
Throughout her years as the director of CIFOR, the Centre for International Forestry Research, Frances Seymour had a similar message.
There is lots of new understanding about the importance of forests, and the fact that heads of state are talking about protecting forests because they understand that we cannot reach our global goal of maintaining the global climate change at less than 2 degrees centigrade without bringing forests into the equation.
Today, the worldwide picture is stark, but by no means hopeless. In the last 200 years, something like 1/3 of the world's natural forests have been cleared to make way for other uses, with 2/3 remaining. But now, people are at last responding to the challenge. In 2012, the Bonn Initiative was launched, an ambitious plan to restore 150 million hectares of deep land to its original condition. But in Brazil, this process had already started several years earlier. There are thought to be at least 200 million hectares of land in Brazil that have been badly farmed or degraded in some way or another. It was here in Bahia the movement started, called the Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact. Its goal was to re-establish 15 million hectares of forest before the middle of this century. This will not only reduce the threat of climate change, but provide employment for 60,000 people over a period of 20 years. It will not be original virgin forest, but something very like it, as Professor Senanaika explains.
If you take that plantation and want to make it do some of the functions that a forest does, we got to retrofit it. What is retrofit? Look at it again and say, okay, what is missing from here? If we are going to be analogous, similar to the native forest, and we look at this one, okay, there are no epiphytes, there are no lianas, there are no palms, there are no rattans. Okay, we have to bring those back here into this plantation. Then this plantation acts more like a forest. That is what analog forestry is about.
The Atlantic Forest Restoration Pact, the first project of its kind anywhere in the world, brings together landowners, universities and green movements, all with the common aim of preventing any further damage to the environment. Fieldwork has already started in many places in Bahia. 200 members of the Atlantic Forest Pact are gathered in Rio to introduce their forest restoration program to a wider audience. The group has set itself the target of restoring 17% of forest land, but there's a good chance this figure could be doubled by the middle of the century. The conference was supported by Japan, and interest in similar movements will increase in Brazil and also internationally, as demonstrated by the Bonn Challenge Initiative. To restore land from degradation is now a global task that is more important than ever in order to mitigate climate change. 1.5 billion hectares the world over, an enormous area, are estimated to be available for this purpose. This is perhaps the first revolutionary step to find a solution to make our planet able to feed the 3 billion people soon arriving. But in the end, there is just one underlying factor at the root of all problems facing this fragile planet. We're cutting down the forests, we're contaminating the fresh water supply, we're damaging the ozone layer, we're plundering the oceans, we're decimating the wildlife, we're losing control of the climate, and all for one reason: overpopulation. Every aspect of life on this planet must give way before the onward march of the human species. Forrester Wing Sutton predicted decades ago what would occur should we continue to make so many demands on the forests, and he was completely right.
Currently, the world's population is increasing by 3 people every single second. That's about 90 to 100 million every year. To satisfy their wood needs, we're going to have to find another 70 million cubic meters of wood every year into the future. That means we have to find another New Zealand every 2 months or another British Columbia every year.
An overpopulated planet and the way we humans have mismanaged our natural resources are probably the 2 biggest threats to our long-term survival. One conference after another keeps the situation on the agenda to encourage our world society to take action. Lester Brown is very well aware of the situation.
My guess is that the wake-up call for us, whether we're thinking about population growth or forests or water or what have you, is going to come on the food front. And the first economic indicator will be rising grain prices. The first social indicator will be an increase in the number of hungry people, a huge increase in the number of hungry people. And the third indicator will be an increase in the number of failing states and political instability in the world. We don't know exactly where these tipping points are because nature determines them, and nature is the timekeeper. But we can't see the clock. So it leaves us with a sense of unease and uncertainty, not knowing quite where things are, and not knowing exactly how much time we have left to reverse these trends.
There are many mountains to climb, but the signs are that we humans are coming to our senses, just in time. Today, there is a far better understanding of forest management, to take just one example, and a far greater willingness to tackle sensitive issues than there was just a few years ago.
We also have some initiatives that wouldn't have been thinkable 20 years ago. For example, 20 years ago, in many forest countries, you couldn't talk about illegal logging. You couldn't talk about corruption in the forestry sector. These were just topics that were taboo. You couldn't even talk about indigenous people's rights because that was just politically, an unacceptable topic to bring up. Now, we can talk about indigenous people's rights. Are they always protected? No, but we can openly, support groups that are fighting to protect those rights. Is corruption still with us? Yes, it is, but heads of state are talking about that too and putting into place new mechanisms of transparency and accountability so that corruption can be identified and rooted out. We can talk about illegal logging, and in fact, not only can we talk about it, but now governments are starting to enter into bilateral voluntary trade agreements to guarantee that the timber that they export is sourced from legally managed forests. So that's just a huge change in 20 years. So am I impatient that it's taken 20 years to get to where we are now? Yes, I am. But does it give me hope that change can happen? Yes, it does.